Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the sunrise. A very good morning to you. Now I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to keep you company because I have a lot of fun things coming your way. Okay, so make sure you stay tuned for that because I have so many things that I'm gonna be talking about, so many topics that we're gonna get into as well. So make sure you stay tuned. Now you're tuned into Relax Radio, and on Relax Radio we talk about everything related to the world, everything right here in the United Kingdom as well. Now, we talk about sports, we talk about health, we talk about science, fitness, technology, whatever it is. If you tune into Relax Radio, you can find it right here on Relax Radio. So make sure you keep it tuned because we have a lot of amazing content that will make sure you're aware. Now, make sure to follow us on our socials as well, which is Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and make sure you follow us so you can keep yourself updated on our content as well. Now, another thing you can also do is actually to download our app on your iOS or Android device, so you can keep yourself you can keep yourself informed about everything that is happening in the world. So make sure you do that. But anyway, you're with me, Sarah, and today I'll actually be talking about how the world gained 5.2 million millionaires during the pandemic. And I know it sounds crazy because it's a pandemic and everyone was struggling in the middle of a pandemic. So how exactly did the world gain 2.5 million so how exactly did the world gain 2.5 million millionaires last year during during the COVID crisis? Okay, so let's get into it. So COVID 19 obviously caught everyone by surprise because it was a pandemic. No one saw it coming, and no one actually expected this sort of pandemic because everyone was just living their normal lives. Things were finally getting back to normal. Then obviously what happened was COVID happened, and then things went back to being very abnormal, and that's what it is. But anyway, um, even though we didn't see the pandemic coming, obviously the inequality it brought in its wake was very much predictable because inequality has existed long before the pandemic. So this whole problem of inequality, this whole problem of the widening wage gap, that existed way before the pandemic. And if anything, the pandemic has only has only widened that already existing or gap that exists between rich and poor people in society. um so obviously, that's what I mean when I say we should have seen this coming, because inequality anyway existed way before the pandemic. And if you actually take a look back into history, if you take a look back into everything that we actually all the pandemics that happened way before, you'll actually begin to realize that all these pandemics actually increase the inequality among the rich and the poor. So obviously then it wasn't much of a surprise when COVID-19 also just exacerbated and made those already pre-existing unequal conditions so much more distinctive, right? So obviously that is what we'll be talking about, because this wage gap has actually affected a lot of people. Now we'll also be talking about how this wage gap actually also exists because of the way taxation works for the rich and the poor as well. So we'll be talking about all of that, so make sure you keep it tuned. But let's get into some statistics right now. Okay, so the global wealth gap actually widened during the COVID pandemic, and and basically it increased the ranks of the world's millionaires by 5.2 million, because the rich actually cashed in on the surging stock and house prices. So the figures of this is actually detailed in the annual Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report, which basically captures how emergency interest rate cuts and government stimulus measures actually benefited people who are actually in need of state support the least. So what I mean when I say that is, obviously it benefited people who were earning enough money. And I'm talking about people who were earning people who were rich. It actually benefited people who were rich simply because of the fact that these stimulus checks that were there, that the interest rate cuts that were there actually just helped this rich people. So obviously, because of that, that is how the wage gap increased. There's also a multitude of other reasons as to why the wage gap increased, which we will be getting into right now. So basically, the figures that were in the Credit Suisse report, or the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report, actually showed how these stimulus measures and the emergency interest rate cuts actually benefited those people who were in the least need of state support, because it helped the assets grow, and it helped the assets grow despite the fact that the economy was having a downturn. And apparently, dollar millionaires actually now account for more than 1% of the global population for the first time in history. And a figure showed that 56.1 million individuals had assets worth more than 1 million in 2020, which is about 720 which is about 720 million pounds, right? So obviously, when it comes to that, we've seen that there is a huge inequality that actually exists, the huge inequality that actually exists in the world right now, simply because of the pandemic, simply because of how bad the situation has gotten. And because this huge wage gap, because this wage gap exists, because it has actually exacerbated some of these living conditions, or made some of the problems that are faced by poor communities so much more distinctive. It's very important that we talk about it and we try to address it as much as possible, because obviously, with as time grows, the amount of millionaires in the world will also increase. And then obviously, if millionaires are going to increase, then we also need to think about ways in which we can actually help poor income families, or even ways in which we can incentivize them to earn much better than they do right now. So while we know that so obviously, when millionaires in the world, when they increase, obviously we know that then the wage inequality will also increase as well. So what we need to understand is that when initially, at the beginning of the pandemic, when our governments were actually trying to come up with different ways in which we can handle the economic downturn or the downfall, European governments actually probably, they presumably considered these outcomes when designing these wide ranging measures that were there, or that they put in place to protect employment and support sectors that were being hit by the pandemic. But however, even though they were considering all of this, they were trying to they were trying to help the support sector, they were trying to help all these other businesses and all of that. The measures that they've put in place, or the measures they have taken, hasn't exactly been effective enough to contain the growing gap between the rich and the poor. And if you take the European Union, 8% of workers educated to lower secondary level or below actually lost their jobs between the first quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2020. And over that same time period, the number of jobs for workers with university degrees actually increased by 3%. And the jobs for employees with middle level qualifications actually declined by 5%. So that just goes to show that while a lot of poor people lost their jobs, a lot of poor people lost their main source of income. For people who were much wealthier, for people who were much more educated, it actually helped them get more jobs, right? Look, we understand that when it comes to, or something we need to understand when it comes to employment, when it comes to getting a job, especially, is the fact that it's a fact that when you're more educated, then chances are you're going to get a better job. But also, at the same time, we need to understand that a lot of the reason that people can't afford to continue their studies, a lot of the reasons as to why people can't continue with their studies, is because it's expensive. They come from poor income households, and they can't really afford it, especially if they're primary caregivers, if they're breadwinners of that family. Or say your parent, say either your mother, or your father, or both your parents died when you were young. or something happened and eventually you're the one that has to take care of the rest of your family or the rest of your siblings actually, then that means that you actually don't really have time to pursue a university degree, or you don't have time to pursue another course that will help you, simply because of the fact, look, it's stressful enough to take care, to provide for an entire family, and they also have to go to a job and need to make sure that everything's okay. So obviously in that sense, when you think about it, it's actually quite sad and it's actually quite disheartening how poor people have lost their jobs so much more than all the rich people out there. And when we're talking about this, it also makes us question as to whether we can actually tax millionaires, if we can tax the wealthiest people in our societies to actually help poor people. And this is when things like the wealth tax come in, and this is when a lot of countries do, like Switzerland have the wealth tax, but it hasn't. The thing is, there is a lot of pros and cons to it. The wealth tax works differently in different countries, and just because you implement it right here, it doesn't mean that it might have the same effects that you can see in other countries, right? So obviously when you are trying to implement things like wealth tax, or when you're considering things like that, obviously there is a lot of research, there is a lot of research that goes into it, because you need to sort of make sure that it actually helps these poor people, and you need to also make sure that the funds, that these people are taxed in a way that will benefit society so much more, right? So obviously we also need to take a look at the way our economic systems are structured, because sometimes our economic systems are structured in a way where people who actually earn a lot of money from stocks or dividends actually have to pay much less tax than people who earn, or much less than people who have to pay taxes from their income. So the tax rates for income and the tax rates for stocks and dividend, there's a huge difference, because the tax rates for stocks and dividends is much smaller, right? So obviously when it comes to things like that, there is a lot of discussion that we need to do, and I will be getting into it, but I will be getting into that after this small break. So make sure you stay tuned, because we have a lot to talk about the pandemic. We have a lot to talk about all these huge inequalities that exist, and why we really need to discuss it and try to change the situation, to make sure that our futures are better for everyone.
Now, there's a lot of conversation around who pays more taxes, if it is the rich or if it is the poor, right? But when you are basically going out and then during a day, you go to a restaurant, you have to pay taxes there. If you buy a car, you have to pay taxes there. So why is it even a conversation that, the rich pay less taxes, or the poor pay more taxes? Why is it a conversation like that?
Because it's true, the rich generally pay less tax. A rich person walks into a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's, they're not going to get a different bill than another person, right? They're still going to pay the same VAT on those goods, they're still going to pay the same thing. So that's all the same. However, the differences come in if you can pay yourself from your own company, you can structure it in a way that you pay less income tax through paying a bit of salary, paying dividends and so forth, and then also deferring income. Also, your pension payments or contributions can be different. So that increases your tax sort of gap, if you want to use it that way. Where a PAYE person just gets paid salary and bonus. And now those are the most highly taxed sources of income in the UK, definitely, in the UK. We've seen it, right? If an owner of a large public traded company does something wrong, irrelevant of what that company does or how valuable that company is, the stock generally falls into a pool of nothing, right? Because in a public company where the stock is traded openly on the stock exchange, the value of that stock is driven by supply and demand, it's driven by emotion, it's driven by news, it's driven by quite a lot of variables over and above the actual accounting or total net worth of that company. I mean, we've seen it, right? If an owner of a large public traded company does something wrong, irrelevant of what that company does or how valuable that company is, the stock generally falls into a pool of nothing, right? And the company may still have value and may still be doing quite a good things.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Sunrise. Welcome to Relax Radio. Now, I was talking about how the pandemic has actually given rise to a lot of millionaires, and why we need to talk about it, and why it's so important that we actually pay attention to it and talk about this situation. Now, if you're just tuning in, we were just talking about how many millionaires have actually, or rather, how many millionaires. How many millionaires were actually created last year, and we were talking about the statistics when it came to the percentage, or rather the comparison, or rather we were comparing the percentages between people from low income families, or from low income households who lost their jobs, versus people from people from richer income households, or higher income households, that didn't really lose their jobs, but actually just got a lot of benefit from the fact that got a lot of benefit from the fact that there was a pandemic, right? So that's what we were talking about, and we'll get back into that conversation because that is something very important. Now, if you like some of the content we do, make sure you follow us on our socials, which is Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok, so you can always make sure that you're updated, that you're always informed, because that's what we do right here on Relax Radio. We talk about everything, whether it's finance, whether it's business, whether it's economics, or even things like science, health, culture, entertainment. So make sure you stay tuned because we talk about absolutely everything and anything, okay? So let's actually get into our conversation about how the pandemic has given rise to so many millionaires, right? So we'll talk about why the inequality gap actually increased. So according to the Credit Suisse Wealth Report, the contrasting fortunes between poor people and rich people were actually highlighted because people are already on lower earnings suffered job losses, and there was a drop of their income due to the economic slowdown, right? And obviously that was something that most of us experience because most of us don't belong to what you would consider high income households, right? Most of us belong to middle income households, and some of us belong to poor income households. So because of that, the effects of the pandemic was so much more worse for us than for all the rich people out there, right? And this was obviously because our companies had to sort of cut down costs. The companies had to make sure that they had enough money to function. So we had a lot of salary cuts. We had a lot of drop of income, salary cuts, and we also some of us lost our jobs because of the economic situation that is currently prevailing because of the pandemic. Now, I want to actually take a look back, or I want to actually divert your attention to. Actually America. Remember that time when there was a lot of controversy about how the people or the employers of Amazon actually got paid really small salaries, and the salaries that they got paid wasn't actually enough for them. And also, how there was a lot of conversation about how their working conditions and their working hours were actually very long and very tiring and very draining. Well, I want to actually talk about it because the fact that there is this certain minimum salary that needs to be paid, and the fact that you can only make a certain amount of money for an hour, things like that. Those are things that we need to talk about. So I'll be talking about it right now. um Remember how Jeff Bezos actually very proudly boasted in a letter, saying that their lowest paid Amazon worker actually made more than 40 million Americans, simply because Amazon raised their minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 all the way back in 2018. Now, what needs to be understood is that sometimes when it comes to them raising their minimum wage, when it comes to minimum wage in general, sometimes when you calculate it, sometimes it's not enough. It's not enough for people to live on. So for example, if you take the US and how they make $15 per an hour. Imagine if they work for 10 hours, they'd only make $150. And honestly, if you are the primary if you're the primary breadwinner, if you are the primary caregiver of a family, then is that really enough money for you to survive on? Is that really enough money for you to actually provide for your whole family and make sure they at least have some sort of food to eat? Right now, obviously, when it comes to minimum wage, obviously, when governments are setting a limit for minimum wage, there's a lot of things that are taken into consideration. However, in the middle of a pandemic, when there's inflation, when the prices of things are rising, when the prices of houses are rising, and when the stock market has fallen, it then makes you question as to whether these minimum wages they set during normal times actually needs to be changed at this point of time, because people are all suffering. And that is a huge question that we really need to think about. That is a question that companies, governments all need to think about, because while I understand that a lot of companies, have found it very hard to survive in the middle of a pandemic because of the fact that they can't work the same way they used to, especially things like restaurants, where they've had to, where they were closed down because of the lockdown and things like that. Obviously, companies like that have had to face a lot of loss. They've had to face a lot of difficulty as well. So then, there is a huge problem about profit and how you can actually make sure that people who earn minimum wages can actually survive in the middle of a pandemic as well. So now when we now this whole Amazon situation and this whole situation about how their minimum wage wasn't actually enough, and all those controversial topics that were there some time back. Now, some of those conditions, some of those things actually existed way before the pandemic, right? Those were pre-existing conditions, and they were just exacerbated by the pandemic. Now, if anything, the pandemic has shown that the sort of policies that we have, the sort of steps that we take to actually deal with inequality, the steps we take to make sure that the inequality gap is lessened, aren't actually enough, or they're not even effective enough, simply because of the fact that when it comes to a pandemic, if the wage gap increases so much, then that just goes to say that these actions and the policies that the government, or even companies have been taking, actually isn't effective enough. So the rise in wealth inequality was actually not caused by the pandemic itself. Like, that wasn't the only reason, but obviously there were other there were other conditions that existed way before the pandemic that actually exacerbated these situations, right? Now, something else that also needs to be kept in mind is that the reason why the wage gap probably increased was simply because of the consequences of actions undertaken to mitigate its impact, primarily lower interest rates, right? This is what was actually said by the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report's authors. And they said that a lot of these actions that were taken to offset the effects of the COVID 19 pandemic actually just contributed to a sizable increase in wealth inequality and led to the widest wealth gap since 2016. So, 2020-21, as during this pandemic, has actually been the widest wealth gap in the world ever since 2016. And another thing that we need to keep in mind is the fact that when it comes to all these people who were affected by the pandemic, who lost their jobs, who had salary cuts and whatnot, a lot of these people aren't just low income, people from low income households, right? And we're also talking about people of color, people from marginalized communities, and we're talking about other people from discriminated and marginalized societies, because it has affected them very heavily as well. And we've seen a lot of graphs. We've seen that there's a lot of inequality when it comes to um, when it comes to the ways in which we address some of these issues, right? So because of that, because of the fact that so many people are struggling, it has also very adversely affected people of color who are living all around the world as well. And it's not just here in the UK, it's also in countries like the United States of America or even other European countries, right? So obviously we're looking at something that hasn't only affected a certain group of people, but rather a majority of people living in society, because majority of society is actually just made up from poor income households and middle income households. So that's why it's been very devastating. It's been a very it's been very scary and difficult for all these people out there who have lost their jobs and lost their income simply because of the pandemic. Now, when we're talking about the rise in billionaires, or rather the millionaires, all around the world, some countries actually had a huge rise, right? So I will get into that, because the US actually accounted for nearly a third of the world's 5.2 new millionaires last year, and they added 1.7 million to the country's total, which is now at 22 million. So the pandemic actually just increased, or rather contributed 1.7 million new millionaires to the country's total, which is now 22 million. So because of that increase, the increase in millionaires in the United States of America has also increased. And that is what I was talking about when I said that a lot of rich people actually benefit from situations that a lot of us suffer from. So Germany actually followed second because they added 633,000 millionaires, and the UK was sixth in the rankings of those countries, minting the most new rich, and added 258,000 millionaires. So our country now actually has 2.5 million individuals with assets more than 1 million, right? So it's very, very important that we actually consider these statistics, and we actually consider the fact that when it comes to dire situations like pandemics, whether it's understandable, whether it's whether it is something that we can actually do when it comes to taxing the rich, right? Whether wealth tax could actually be placed when it comes to a situation like a pandemic. So obviously, that is something that really needs to be focused on, simply because of the fact that a lot of people have had to suffer, right? And because a lot of people are suffering, because there is a lot of people who are poor, or who have who come from middle income households, like I said, they tend to make up majority of society. Because there are so many people like that, it's very important that we try to help these people as well. Now I know, we all know actually that there were stimulus checks in the United States of America, but even when it comes to these stimulus checks, even when it comes to trying to when it comes to passing these stimulus checks, there is a lot of work that goes into it. And sometimes even the say, even if you do pass a stimulus check, that doesn't always mean that everyone gets it. Only a certain amount of people will get it. And then there's again the whole question of inequality pops up, because look, if you are poor income, if you're from a middle income household and you're not getting the stimulus checks that other people seem to be getting, then is it really helping? Are we actually trying to reduce this are we actually trying to reduce the wealth gap that is there currently, or are we actually in fact just worsening it? So these are some questions that we really need to think about, especially governments and companies when they're having pay cuts, when they're firing people. So those are some things that they need to think about as well. Now make sure you stay tuned, because I'll be back in a few minutes to actually talk about the increasing wage gap, taxation, and so many more. So make sure you stay tuned.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh. So that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, got me thinking. You want to stand out. Why do you want to stand out though so much, especially with these kind of shirts when you're riding? There must be a purpose behind it, right?
Well, when you say a purpose, Nick, what I do, I wear the shirts. Mainly one because they're nice and bright, so they make me visible, especially if I'm riding on the road.
Okay. That's very important, right? Because you want cars, yeah.
Very important. And also, like, people see me in like cafes, and perhaps I shouldn't be saying this on here, I suppose, but in the bar afterwards.
All right.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh, so that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Girls, ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, you look like a guy who would do.
You know me too well. You know me too well, Nick.
One of the easiest ways to increase your net worth is to ensure that you have higher cash flows. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to not buy things on hire purchase, not buy things over months and months because you can't afford them now, but you want it. It's kind of that delayed gratification. Rather than buy that couch, that car, that stereo, that computer, whatever item, and pay it off over 12, 24, 36 months at an interest rate, rather invest that money, make do with what you've got, and then after 12, 24, 36 months, take the money that you've now invested and buy that good. An asset could be anything that appreciates or reduces a tax bill. So it could still be a liability, but it reduces their tax bill. And I'm not going to go into the technicalities because that's out of our remit here. However, for our use or our purpose, what we are talking for the listeners here is I would put this definition of an asset forward. An asset is anything that increases your income. Anything.
Now, there's a lot of conversation around who pays more taxes, if it is the rich or if it is the poor, right? When you are basically going out and during a day, if you go to a restaurant, you have to pay taxes there. If you buy a car, you have to pay taxes there. So why is it even a conversation that, the rich pay less taxes or the poor pay more taxes? Why is it a conversation like that?
Because it's true, the rich generally pay less tax. A rich person walks into a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's, they're not going to get a different bill than another person, right? They're still going to pay the same VAT on those goods. They're still going to pay the same thing. So that's all the same. However, the differences come in if you can pay yourself from your own company, you can structure it in a way that you pay less income tax through paying a bit of salary, paying dividends and so forth, and then also deferring income. Also, your pension payments or contributions can be different. So that increases your tax sort of gap, if you want to use it that way. Where a PAYE person just gets paid salary and bonus. And now those are the most highly taxed sources of income in the UK, definitely, in the UK.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on Sunrise. Now you tuned into Relax Radio, and if you're just joining in, we're talking about how the pandemic has given rise to so many millionaires. And earlier we were just talking about how, or rather, we were talking about how the wage gap has widened, why it has widened, and the ways in which we can actually, try to change it, or even the way in which, or rather, the fact that we actually need to take a step back and think about how the wage gap has widened and why it's causing a lot of inequality around, not only here in the UK but also around the world as well. So that's what we were talking about. Now you're tuned in to Relax Radio, and I'm Sarah, and I'll be keeping you company all the way until 9 a.m. So a very, very good morning. I'm super excited to be here and talk to you about all these things as well. Now, if you have any questions, any opinions, any thoughts that you would like to share with us, make sure you text me on 07852 473 and you can get in touch with me, and I can share your opinions and your thoughts with everyone who's listening in as well. And I will be really, really glad to do that, because I want to know your opinion, because it's very important that we, get to know each other's opinions, that we share each other's opinions, so we can have a better conversation. So make sure you do that by texting me on that number. And you can also, if you're really, really interested in what we do, you can also download our app from the App Store, or even the Play Store on your iOS or your Android device, right? So make sure you do that, because it's going to keep you informed, it's going to keep you entertained as well. So make sure you do that. But let's get into what we were talking about earlier, because right now I'm going to be talking about the taxation of the rich and poor, and how exactly it works, and why there's a huge disparity when it comes to taxation. Right now, I want to actually talk about something that Warren Buffett actually said sometime back, almost a decade ago, and something that actually became really famous. Now, what he said was that he actually paid a lower tax rate than his secretary, thanks to the many loopholes and deductions that benefit the wealthy. Right, and then when he says that, we begin to understand that, these loopholes, these deductions, or the way our systems are structured, is essentially to benefit the wealthy, right? We understand that when it comes to our tax systems, or even our economic structures, they're they're structured in such a way that when tax, or rather when rich people are using it to pay their taxes, they actually have to pay a less amount than people from low income or middle income households. So what you need to understand, or what we need to keep in mind, is the fact that these low rates of taxes are not actually driven completely by tax avoidance schemes, but also they're a part of how our system is designed, which is what I said, right? Where sometimes where you get your money from, or at least how you sort of package your money, matters, because investment income and capital gains are taxed at lower rates than income from work. Now, that's what I was talking about as well. If it's something like dividends, then you're taxed, definitely much lower than the amount you're taxed when it comes to your income. So that is something that needs to be kept in mind as well. So the National Audit Office recently actually highlighted that the government offers tax reliefs claimed to incentivize activities like entrepreneurship, or other activities, without actually checking whether they achieve these aims. So again, this is another reason as to why taxation works very, very differently for the rich and the poor, because like the National Audit Office says, they don't really even check into it and see if the see that these companies actually achieve these accomplishments or goals that they have set out for. So actually, they just give a lot of tax benefit when it comes to people, or rather when it comes to all these high earning, very important companies, and even rich people in general. Okay, and we'll also talk about the reason as to why those on the lowest incomes are paying the biggest proportion of their income tax. And that's actually because of because of all of these indirect taxes that exist. And a lot of these indirect taxes are actually taxes like VAT and tax on tobacco or alcohol, and you know uh, taxes on alcohol and fuel, and they're all charged at the same rate to all income groups, right? So obviously, if you're earning a lower salary, and if all the taxes the taxes that are charged on these items are indirect taxes, and that means everyone has to pay the same amount of tax, right? So if you're actually from a low income family, or you're a low income household, or your income isn't as high enough as all the rich people out there, then that means you significantly pay so much more taxes than rich people do, because you have to spend more on certain things, simply because it's taxed the same for everyone, right? So obviously, because of all these indirect taxes that exist, there is a lot of data, there is a lot of statistics that show that the poor 5% of the country actually pays so much more than the richer 5% of the country. And that is why there is a widening wage gap. That is why there is a huge amount of inequality, because of the fact that rich people actually tend to pay less taxes than poor people put together. And even the fact that there has been a significant rise in public borrowing that was necessitated by the economic slump, has actually raised pressure for future tax rises. So obviously, because of the current economic slump that we're facing because of the pandemic, and people not really being able to pay taxes, and people even having to borrow to buy essential things to pay taxes, because of all of that, what this means is that in the future taxes will most probably rise, and obviously that's basically to fund all the public debt that the government has had to deal with, that the government has had to accumulate because of the pandemic. So obviously, what that means is that there is going to be a significant rise for for taxes in the future, and it's important that we don't or it's important that we change the tax policies in a way that rich people actually pay more taxes than poor people, because it actually, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense at all. If you're poor and you're, say, you're earning only a certain amount, it makes absolutely no sense for, or it's very unfair for you to spend almost half of your salary on paying taxes, when you especially find it so hard to survive because of how low your income is. So researchers have actually estimated that up to 20 billion extra in tax could be raised by the government if it taxed capital gains and dividends at existing headline income tax rates, which is about 45% for those receiving more than £150,000 a year. Okay, so to put it simply, if governments actually start taxing capital gains and dividends higher, or at the same rate that the same rate that taxing headline income tax rates, um, we could actually help to it could actually help to lessen the wage gap. It could help to lessen the inequality gap that exists in society, right? And this is something very important. This is something that they really need to consider, because a lot of people are finding it more hard than ever before to actually pay their taxes, right? And I said some time back as well that when it comes to how much people used to borrow, especially people from poor income households, they've had to borrow so much more than they used to before the pandemic, right? Because at least then they had they could go to work and earn a certain amount of money, and then just borrow some money to depend on for the other days. But what's happening right now is, because they're stuck at home, because some of them have lost their jobs, it's very, very hard for them to actually survive without borrowing money. So because of that, even though a lot of researchers predict an economic boom in the future or in the long run, a lot of us personally right now are struggling with the economic impacts of the pandemic. And the thing is, if we don't address these issues right now, if we don't address some of the struggles that are being faced by middle income and poor income households, then the situation is eventually going to get even more worse, right? And that's why it's very important to address this problem as soon as it happens, instead of just waiting, instead of just thinking, oh, you know what, I could probably deal with this later, and keep postponing the fact that you need to deal with that problem as soon as you can. Because at one point, the wage inequality gap is going to get so bad. And when people's and this is something that researchers have found as well, when there is a lot of frustration, when people are struggling a lot, that actually leads to a lot of civil unrest, and that leads to a lot of violence. So it's very important that we address these issues. It's very important that the government tries to reduce this existing wage gap, to actually make sure that it benefits everyone the same way. And obviously, if you logically think about it, it's not going to benefit everyone the same way, because rich people are going to always have more benefit. They're going to always have more luxury. And the argument you would use to actually defend that is simply the fact that they worked hard for it. They deserve all of that, and because of that, you need to be lenient towards them when it comes to taxes, because this is their hard-earned money as well. But then, if that's the case, you can also look at it from another perspective and say, look, you also need to understand that people from poor income households or middle income households are also working hard for the money that they earned. And obviously, then if that's the case, then it doesn't make any sense to tax those people, because those people have lesser incomes than rich people put together, right? So that is why there is a lot of there's a lot of controversy when it comes to those arguments and those perspectives as well. So it's very, very important that we sort of try to adjust ourselves, that we try to adjust the policies that our companies, our governments are centered around, to make sure that it will benefit everyone alike, that it will not everyone alike, but it will benefit everyone proportionally, and that it will be, that it will happen in a fair way. Now, make sure you stay tuned, because I'll be back to talk about how exactly all these things contributed to the rise of millionaires in a pandemic, and how how some of the changes in the market, especially stock markets, surging house prices, have actually contributed for the increase of wealth of these millionaires. So until then, make sure you stay tuned, because right now we're going to head into a small break.
Climb Mount Everest. That is that's in my bucket list. You're laughing, but that is the facts right there. I'd love to do that. That is something I'm looking forward to do, hopefully.
Climb Everest.
Mount Everest. I mean, okay, not the very tip of Mount Everest, maybe the base camp at least.
They're talking about mental health. Well, if you went out and got some exercise in the fresh air, that will improve your mental health. It will make you feel better.
That's true. That is true. I wholeheartedly agree. But then for some people, it's how do you find the motivation to, especially when it comes to riding a bicycle, to do it again and again and again and again? It's a cycle that you have to be used to. How do you do it? What makes you wake up in the morning and decide, hey, I'm going to pick my bike up today. I'm going to cycle. What makes you want to do that?
What makes me want to do that?
Yeah. What do you like? What could you give listeners, like people listening in right now? What kind of tip could you give them?
Well, the first tip I would give them, if you haven't tried it before, try it. It can open up new horizons. It will make you fitter. It will definitely make you fitter. Cycling is one of the best forms of aerobic exercise you can do.
It sounds like, if you think about it, yeah, it sounds like great fun. Because what essentially you're trying to say is also at the same time, when if you look at it from this perspective, with regards to mental health, especially when you look at it with mental health, this is another way to fight it. I feel like you go outside, you meet more people, you interact with, socially, you will interact with more people, and you're keeping fit, you're making connections, you're breathing in the good and exhaling the bad. I feel like that's a great thing right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got a better way with words than I have, I'll tell you. But you're quite right. What you say there. You're quite right.
I've been doing this for quite some time. Hey, you'll get the hang of it.
I've been doing it for about 10 minutes now, so yeah.
That I can never really understand people staying in one room the whole day when you can have the world to see. I am a traveler. I travel. I love traveling. Traveling is just one of the things I do. And on top of my bucket list was, to one time, hopefully when I get there, go to Nepal and climb Mount Everest. That is that's in my bucket list. You're laughing, but that is the facts right there. I'd love to do that. That is something I'm looking forward to do, hopefully.
Climb Everest.
Mount Everest. Okay, not the very tip of Mount Everest, maybe the base camp at least.
Base camp, yeah.
At least.
We should be able to cycle there.
Oh.
There's a lot of conversation around who pays more taxes, if it is the rich or if it is the poor, right? But when you are basically going out and during a day, you go to a restaurant, you have to pay taxes there. If you buy a car, you have to pay taxes there. So why is it even a conversation that, the rich pay less taxes or the poor pay more taxes? Why is it a conversation like that?
Because it's true that the rich generally pay less tax. A rich person walks into a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's, they're not going to get a different bill than another person, right? They're still going to pay the same VAT on those goods. They're still going to pay the same thing. So that's all the same. However, the differences come in if you can pay yourself from your own company, you can structure it in a way that you pay less income tax through paying a bit of salary, paying dividends and so forth. And then also deferring income. Also, your pension payments or contributions can be different. So that increases your tax sort of gap, if you want to use it that way. Where a PAYE person just gets paid salary and bonus. And now those are the most highly taxed sources of income in the UK, definitely, in the UK. We've seen it, right? If an owner of a large public traded company does something wrong, irrelevant of what that company does or how valuable that company is, the stock generally falls into a pool of nothing, right? Because in a public company where the stock is traded openly on the stock exchange, the value of that stock is driven by supply and demand, it's driven by emotion, it's driven by news, it's driven by quite a lot of variables over and above the actual accounting or total net worth of that company. I mean, we've seen it, right? If an owner of a large public traded company does something wrong, irrelevant of what that company does or how valuable that company is, the stock generally falls into a pool of nothing, right? And the company may still have value, it may still be doing quite a good things.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Sunrise. Now, welcome to my show, The Sunrise, where I'll be giving you company all the way until 9 a.m. Now, I'm super excited to be here, and a very good morning to you if you're just tuning in. If you're just tuning in, also, we were just talking about how the pandemic has given rise to so many millionaires. Because if you're thinking about it, it sounds quite impossible because so many people are struggling in the middle of a pandemic. So how exactly did it create so many millionaires? And the answer to that is obviously the huge inequality gap that exists within society, not just here in the UK, but also everywhere, all around the world. Because we've seen how the pandemic has exacerbated the inequality gap. All around the world, and created a lot of distance between the rich and the poor. So earlier we were just talking about how tax works differently for the rich and the poor, and how income tax is taxed much larger than when it comes to capital gains and dividends. So that's what we were talking about. And we also said that when it comes to the way our economic systems are structured, when it comes to the way our tax systems are structured, it's essentially there to benefit the rich and not necessarily the poor. So that's what we were talking about. And we'll get into it, because right now I actually want to focus on how exactly did we end up with millionaires in the middle of a pandemic. So, you know, anyway, at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of, all of this, the millionaires or even the wealthiest people were already sitting on large holdings of stocks and properties that were relatively unaffected by the economic downturn, right? And what that means is that some of the stocks they owned, some of the shares they owned, were actually very much unaffected by the pandemic and by the economic downturn that was caused by the pandemic. So the share prices, we all know that the share prices actually collapsed in the first half of 2020, but they actually recovered in the later months of the year, which actually ended up in increasing the wealth of men, middle-aged people, and even other wealthier individuals in general, right? And homeowners actually also were very much benefited from this, because most markets also benefited from rising house prices. And this increased by an average 5.6% in 2020. And this is actually according to a separate report, which was by the Knight Frank Global House Price Index, which tracks down prices of houses across 56 countries. And this was the fastest pace of growth for 3 years. So that just goes to show how much these markets, how much these people who are already wealthy actually benefited from the fact that there is a pandemic. And how sometimes that economic downturn that a lot of us had to go through, that a lot of us felt, didn't actually affect them, because they were already rich enough, right? Now, Anthony Sharks, who's actually an economist at the University of Manchester and one of the Credit Suisse report's authors, said that the climbing asset prices did not actually reflect the challenges that most of the world felt during the pandemic. And this is very true, because while a lot of us were struggling, while a lot of us were struggling to stay alive, to pay our bills, to even, pay for the things that, pay for all these essential items, to pay for food, to just pay to be alive, a lot of us were struggling with that. But obviously a lot of the rich people out there who earned a lot, who had a lot of stocks, who had who had a lot of income, didn't really didn't really feel the same things we did. And that's why it says, and that's why he's saying that it didn't actually reflect the impact that the rest of the world felt, simply because of how badly a lot of other people were affected. So like I said again, this is all because of the huge wage inequality gap that actually exists in society, right? And what needs to be kept in mind is that when you look at that situation, it's actually quite sad, it's quite disheartening, because you know that a lot of them are suffering. You know that it's very hard to be alive in the middle of a pandemic. And when all these things are happening around you, the fact that you're struggling to survive itself just goes to show that the wage inequality is something that's very real. It's something that really needs to be addressed, because if we don't address it, a lot of people are just going to go into poverty, and it's going to affect a lot of people, right? Now in total, the global wealth actually grew by 7.4% in 2020 to 418.3 trillion dollars in 2020. So obviously that is a lot of money, and these gains were actually largely attributed to growth in the United States, Europe, and China, because the overall wealth in Latin America and India actually declined. And if we're going to talk about America, or not America, but actually India, currently, because of the huge COVID waves that are there in the country, and also the huge destruction that is there because of COVID, there is that, their markets, their stocks, and everything have taken a huge downturn. Now obviously another thing that needs to be said is the black fungus is also spreading widely there, to a lot of people, and they've actually recorded 28,000 cases right now. So obviously, there is a lot of impact. There is a huge impact actually in India because of COVID, and also because of the fact that people are struggling to stay alive, and all these, especially the fact that the black fungus is now currently happening as well. There is a lot of change. There is a lot of struggle they're going as well. And also, something that really needs to be said is that while there were so many people suffering in India, other people were actually just investing their money in other things, especially rich people. So it just sometimes, if you think about it, it just goes to show how sometimes people who are so rich they can be very heartless sometimes, because you know these are hard times for everyone. And if you're so rich, it definitely doesn't hurt for you to help out a few people. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's what we're talking about. Now global wealth is actually expected to rise a further 39% over the next 5 years, to reach $583 trillion by 2025. And the number of millionaires is actually also estimated to jump by nearly 50% to 84 million individuals. Okay. Now, again, like I said, the fact that the wage gap is going to widen, the fact that there are going to be more millionaires, just goes to show that the wage gap is going to widen. So that is why it's very important that we take these steps. It's very important that we create new policies in a way that will actually help to reduce the wage gap. And the group that is rich enough to actually be considered or counted as ultra high net worth is also expected to expand by nearly 60% to reach 344,000 people. So that's a lot of people, that's a lot of millionaires, and that is a lot of money. But that is also a huge wage gap, and that is also a lot of struggling and suffering for a lot of people from low income and poor income households. Now, that's why we were talking about the pandemic. We were talking about, how the pandemic has given rise to so many millionaires, because it's crazy if you think about it. Like, did you ever just sit back, take a minute, and think, oh my gosh, it's so crazy how there are so many millionaires while there are so many people who are struggling to stay alive. So like I said, again, it's not necessarily only their fault. It's the way the systems are structured. It's the way that we, normalize these things. So obviously, a lot needs to change, but it's very important to keep ourselves updated on these changes as well. So make sure you stay tuned, because I'll be back in a few minutes to actually talk to you about so many other interesting things. And one of them is actually how the flu could be a bigger problem in the United Kingdom this winter, other than COVID, right? So I'll be talking about that, and I'll be giving you a lot of information as well. So make sure you stay tuned. But until then, I'll be back in a few more minutes.